All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a really powerful concept from a piece called The Evolution of Control. The core idea is that if you really want to understand what's happening now, you have to look at the patterns of the past, even when it's uncomfortable. So, let's get into it.
Wow. That's a heavy statement, right? It's designed to make you stop and think. And it's really the heart of the whole argument we're exploring today. The source says this isn't just some metaphor. It's a real historical pattern. We're going to unpack exactly what that means and track how these systems of control have morphed over time.
So, here's the big idea at the heart of all this. American history seems to show this repeating cycle. When one really obvious system of racial control gets torn down, it doesn't just vanish into thin air. Nope, it gets replaced by a new system. One that's a little more subtle, a little harder to see, but one that often achieves very similar results.
Let's actually walk through this timeline, because when you see it laid out like this, the pattern becomes pretty clear. So after slavery was formally abolished, what came next? You get the rise of black codes and convict leasing, which basically created a new form of forced labor. Okay, so once those were challenged, Jim Crow laws took over, enforcing segregation. And as the civil rights movement dismantled Jim Crow, you see the rise of things like redlining, which used housing policy to segregate communities. And after that, the source argues that's when mass incarceration really took off. See the pattern? Each time, it looks like a step forward, but a new kind of control was always there, ready to take its place.
And that shift brings us to right now. The argument is that the very nature of control has changed. It's moved from being physical, obvious, and violent to something that looks, well, boring. It looks like paperwork. It's bureaucratic and systemic. It's less about a whip and more about a spreadsheet. It's not about owning people anymore. It's about managing them, controlling whole communities by messing with their access to housing, jobs, and power through policies and procedures.
Okay, so what does this administrative control actually look like in the real world? Let's break it down and look at three big areas where you can see it operating today: our justice system, the economy, and, of course, technology.
Just look at this. The difference is stark, isn't it? The tools of the past, whips, chains, plantations, they were brutal, and you couldn't miss them. But the tools of today, according to this analysis, are things like debt, surveillance, and algorithms. They're a lot less visible, but their power to manage and exclude people is just as real. Let's start with the first example.
So, the first modern system the source points to is mass incarceration. And the argument here is that the crazy explosion of the U.S. prison population wasn't just some natural reaction to crime rates. It was a system that was built, piece by piece, on purpose.
And to really get your head around the scale of this, just look at this number. The U.S. has about 5% of the world's population, but we house nearly 25%, a quarter of all the prisoners on the entire planet. That disparity is just staggering. It really forces you to ask the question, how on earth did we get here?
And when you look inside that system, the racial disparity is just profound. Black Americans are locked up at a wildly disproportionate rate. But the source is very clear on this point. This isn't because of higher rates of crime, it's because of how the system itself is designed.
So what are the gears and levers that make this machine work? Well, it's not just one thing. It's a whole cocktail of policies. Things like targeted policing in specific neighborhoods, sentencing laws that punish crack and powder cocaine completely differently, cash bail systems that mean you're punished for being poor, and even the profit incentives for private prisons. They all lock together to create these outcomes. It's the whole system. Now let's shift gears and look at the second area, economics. The source argues that if you really want to control a population, you control their ability to build wealth. And today, that's not done with actual chains, but with things like debt and financial roadblocks. You can see right here how specific financial practices really start to function as a system of control. Predatory lending traps people in debt. We see that lower home appraisals in black neighborhoods literally drain generational wealth out of the community. Less access to startup capital makes it harder to build businesses. These aren't just a string of bad luck. The source argues they are part of a larger structure that actively prevents economic stability.
All right, this brings us to the third area, and maybe the most modern and invisible one of all, technology. The algorithms that are quietly running so much of our world are often sold to us as being perfectly neutral and objective. But the source warns that they are actually the next frontier for this exact kind of systemic control.
So, how can a computer program be biased? It's actually a pretty simple process when you break it down. These systems, these algorithms, they learn from historical data. So if the data you feed it reflects decades of human bias in who gets hired, who gets a loan, or who gets arrested, the algorithm doesn't know any better. It just learns that bias as a pattern. Then it automates it, making discrimination something that can scale up instantly, is totally invisible, and crucially, is easy to deny.
And this all connects to this idea of surveillance. In the past, communities were physically monitored by patrols. Today, they're digitally monitored. Think about predictive policing software that just sends more cops to neighborhoods that are already over-policed, which of course just creates a feedback loop. Or data profiling that can slap a high-risk label on someone and cut off their access to jobs or loans, sometimes before they've ever done a single thing wrong.
Okay, so we've seen the what and the how. But why is this modern, invisible kind of control considered so uniquely dangerous? What makes it so different? Let's break that down.
The source argues the real danger lies in these 4 qualities. Because it's bureaucratic and invisible, it just feels like the normal way things work. Because it's automated, individual people don't feel responsible. And because it's deniable, you can always say, hey, it was just the algorithm. It becomes incredibly difficult to challenge or fight back against.
And this point right here, this really gets to the heart of it. There's no single person to blame. There's no overseer with a whip that you can point to. There's just procedures, policies, code. And that facelessness is what makes the system so powerful and so hard to change.
Now, I know this is all pretty heavy stuff, but after laying all of this out, the source is really careful to say that this isn't about creating fear or making people feel hopeless. It's the opposite. It's meant as a call for awareness, for vigilance.
So what's the defense against all of this? What's the playbook? Well, the source lays out a few key ideas. First, awareness. Just knowing how these systems work is a huge first step. Education to understand them. Building economic independence to have more power. Political vigilance to challenge biased policies when you see them. And finally, ownership of businesses, of property, of your own narrative. The central idea is that freedom isn't something that's just handed to you and then it's permanent. It has to be actively defended by every single generation.
And that brings us to the final, critical question that this whole analysis leaves us with. It's not about whether slavery will come back in its old form. It's about whether we, today, have the eyes to see and the will to challenge these new systems of control when they're hidden in plain sight, in our spreadsheets, in our algorithms, and in our administrative code. Definitely something to think about.